Good afternoon, everyone. I am very excited for this week's episode. And we're going to tee this off with an article that was just put out dealing with an issue in California regarding 7 cities that have already passed either warehouse moratoriums or outright bans on warehouses. And this follows a bill that was proposed earlier this year, which would have restricted large warehouses over 100,000 square feet within certain neighborhoods, schools, and so forth. That bill was defeated, but there's clearly a movement underway in California, which coincidentally is North America's largest industrial market. There's a movement underway, at least by some faction of the population that wants to oppose these warehouses. So my guest, who coincidentally lives in Los Angeles, is a sustainability expert. So we're going to get his sense on what's happening in California, and then what some property owners and companies can do to guard against this opposition that's coming, and also what these implications might mean for other markets in North America and the world. So with that, I am pleased to bring on my guest, Grant. Good to chat with you again.
Yeah, Chad, thanks for having me. No, I think it's a great place to start today, and I think the article you're referencing, I think
Oh, we might have lost
there's
your
on a lot of
connection.
interesting aspects that the. Oh, I think I'm back now as well.
Yep,
Can you?
yep, back now. Yeah, just cut out for a second there.
Perfect. Yeah, I think it's interesting. The markets they really reference in this article are really focused on the Inland Empire. So that's your, Redlands, San Bernardino, Ontario, really the big logistics center that serves the port of Los Angeles and the port of Long Beach. And the vacancy rate that you're seeing in industrial buildings out there is right around 1%. So it's a place that desperately needs industrial. Yet at the same time, I think the challenge is not should we build industrial? It's really how we build industrial and how we have this interface between the communities and the industrial sector out there. So yeah, it's interesting. I think these moratoriums are a good place to help pause and maybe redefine how we want to look at developments out there. But I don't think it's as simple as just pausing development and thinking that the problems are going to go away.
So, as I was reading through that article and I dug into it a little bit more, just trying to get more information, like I dug into that bill AB 2840, I believe it
Mhm.
wasn't passed. But from what I'm gathering, it's not necessarily in opposition to warehouses by themselves. There's certainly an element that goes into the construction and just how sustainable these buildings are, but it goes beyond that. It's all the ancillary activities, such as trucks having to drive to and from the buildings.
Mhm.
I read a comment that was interesting, that California, by and large, is the hub for everything coming in and then getting distributed across North America. So California is being asked to essentially pay for this emissions that could come from it, even though the rest of North America is benefiting from it. What do you is Does that a good summary of what the opposition is, or is there even more to it that can be covered in a 800-word article?
Yeah, I look at it from like two lenses. When I think about these, facilities, you're looking at the facility operations itself, so the construction of that facility, and then its physical operations. The on-site combustion of maybe gas fuels or electricity. But I think a lot of what these issues stem down to is the transportation to and from those facilities. I don't think that the communities necessarily have an issue with um, industrial or maybe big box retail or different types of development properties out there. It's the transportation to and from those. It's the large diesel trucks that are going down the streets, that are driving through communities. You mentioned the bill that looks at having a 1,000-foot buffer between schools. It's not because they want the warehouse 1,000 feet from the school. It's they don't want trucks driving. Seeing the pushback right now. There was another interesting bill that was passed by the South Coast Air Quality Management District that governs the air pollution in the Inland Empire, and they call this the indirect source rule. And basically, what it looks at is it's taking the emissions from trucks and finding ways to mitigate those. So it basically says any warehouse in the Inland Empire that's above 100,000 square feet needs to comply with this new rule. It went into effect in 2021. And really what this is doing is it says, let's take your new warehouse you built or your old warehouse, and we'll do a kind of an equation to figure out what your mitigation points you have to reduce over that current year are. So they're looking at number of trucks you have, vehicle trips to and from that facility, use type inside that facility, and they basically create a rating system. So it's kind of 1 to 100 points. And over the course of the year, you're going to be required to reduce those points to essentially zero. And there's a variety of ways you can do that. But if we look at it, it's really all focused on truck emissions. They're looking at, procuring zero emission trucks, near zero emission trucks. So that could be hydrogen fuel cell. So they don't have to be necessarily full electric vehicles at this point, or putting in infrastructure. So bringing in future infrastructure to help those facilities charge maybe shorter long haul electrified vehicles. And there's some even other options where you can actually install maybe solar or renewable energy on your buildings to decrease those points. So, I think there's kind of like 2 points of this problem that we're seeing. It's the design and construction of these facilities, but I think the bigger one is really the transportation of those trucks to and from those facilities. And that's, when I go to entitlement meetings with clients, and we're talking about maybe new developments for industrial, the biggest pushback we hear is not about the actual facility itself. Obviously, we're doing, we're building and helping developers build really high performance, sustainable industrial facilities. But a lot of the questions come around, how are you looking at mitigating noise? How are you looking at mitigating NOx emissions and diesel particulates from the ancillary activities that go into that facility? And I think everyone's trying to grapple with that. Like I said, I don't think the solution is not building that. It's just coming up with ways to really make sure the community feels comfortable. And we're doing our part to really drive down carbon emissions. I do want to touch on the point that you said, because I thought it was interesting about how, you have these different logistics hubs, whether that's Los Angeles, and I'm thinking of North America, specifically LA or Houston or New Jersey, New York. These are big industrial hubs, but those help serve the rest of the country or surrounding countries. So, they do kind of take the bulk of those emissions and are, kind of asked maybe just proportionally to find ways to reduce that for other communities as well. And I look at California, and I think California is definitely a leader when it comes to sustainability and looking at some of those, different ways to approach that. So I think it's great that these rules are coming down, and now it really challenges developers and the owners of these industrial facilities to figure out how they, comply and really kind of push the boundary when it comes to sustainability.
Yeah, well said. And just as an observation on my own end, and I studied the industrial market in North America quite extensively, I think that what California is doing is noble and for good cause. They're trying to make the earth a better place. But I think what's could happen, or runs a high risk of happening anyways, is that you add in taxation with the highest tax rates in North America, you add in port delays, you add in these potential restrictions that are coming. I think it could push companies and developers to start more business friendly areas. So Texas and Florida come to mind, but there's still, and I'm not expecting an answer on that because we'd just be hypothesizing at this point. But what I do firmly believe is that people want to be in California for a reason. I'm always astonished when I hear this fact, and people have probably heard this before, but if you haven't, if California was a separate country, you'd have the 5th largest GDP in the entire world. That's how large that state economy is. And there's a reason that people want to be there, whether it's for lifestyle, whether it's just for business, whether it's east to markets overseas. California is always going to have demand for their market. So there could be a discussion for another day on how this could push some companies out of California to other markets. But let's assume that for the companies that want to be in California and they're willing to pay whatever price they need to be there, what are some of the things that, and I suppose we could break this into a few ways, because we could break this into a developer. What does a developer or property owner need to do from a building standpoint? And then what can companies do from their logistical standpoint on how they operate to be more compliant with either the existing regulations or the coming regulations?
Yeah, no, I'm happy you broke it down that way because I think it's a good distinction to look at both your operations and then the design and construction of facilities. And I think when we help clients look at their overall carbon footprint and really kind of emission standpoint around logistical facilities, we're looking at that in those two perspectives. So we're looking at it the embodied carbon, which is
Think
all
you
the
just cut out there for a
industrial.
bit.
Uh,
Oh, sorry.
uh,
Should we go now?
Yeah. So if we're thinking about the carbon emissions from the construction, we're really looking at what goes into building that. And most of our industrial warehouses are concrete and steel boxes. So
Mhm.
concrete is the most abundantly used material on planet Earth behind water. We use so much concrete across the world, and it's really the main material that goes into building our warehouses. We have concrete tilt-up walls, and we have steel, which is really, I think steel is alone about 9% of our global greenhouse gas emissions. So these two materials make up majority of our construction of these facilities, and they're huge emitters, both the cement and the steel production. So we definitely need to tackle that. So when new developments are coming down, there's ways that developers can look at decreasing the emissions from construction, but then there's also the operations as well. So that could be existing facilities, that could be new facilities that a tenant comes in or the owner comes in and now they're operating this facility for the next 30, 50, 60 years. How do they look at reducing their emissions? So I think there's two great distinctions there. Since we're kind of talking about operations and trucks and energy, let's start there, and then we can kind of unpack some of the stuff in the design side, because I think both are equally interesting. From an operations perspective, I think what we're seeing, you have such a gambit. Existing buildings is such a unique beast because you have facilities of all different ages. Some are brand new buildings that came online, whether they're spec or built to suit for an industrial tenant. Or they're buildings that are 20, 30 years old and are in desperate need of renovations. And I think they both pose unique challenges. When we talk to clients who work, operate, or own multiple of these facilities, we always suggest benchmarking. I always say without data, you don't know where to start. You have to have some data points to understand what buildings are operating better or worse. So we'll come in and we'll help different facilities, basically meter and use their utility information to see how much energy is building A using versus building B. And you do that across an entire portfolio, and it really helps now understand really your opportunities. And if you think about utility usage or energy usage for a building, it's tied directly to cost. So if we keep California in mind, the outside of it kind of being one of the largest economies, if it was its own country, it also has some of the highest utility rates. Our rates are sometimes 4 to 5 times what they are in neighboring states. So another challenge we're seeing is, industrial, maybe manufacturing or light industrial or logistics moving to neighboring states like Nevada and Arizona, because the utility rate there can be 3 times less. And if you have heavy operations, that can be huge savings that get passed along to tenants or kind of materialize themselves in extended revenue. So I think both saving energy is great, obviously, from a sustainability standpoint. It reduces our carbon emissions, lowers greenhouse gas emissions, but it's a smart thing to do financially as well. So by getting those kind of baseline numbers and understanding where your portfolio sits, we can start to make educated assumptions on how do we increase the efficiency and decrease the energy usage of those buildings. And the big driver that we're seeing a lot of people look at is, I think LED lighting. It's pretty standard, but some of these older facilities may have not done a full upgrade on LED lighting. That's a no-brainer, a great place to start. We're also seeing maybe optimizations, and again, industrial it spreads such a large space. That could be manufacturing, light manufacturing, food, cold storage, dry storage. So the energy use intensity of these buildings definitely varies. But again, by benchmarking and understanding the use of the building and what it's looking like in terms of its energy profile, we can find great ways to start reducing those. then once you've reduced, you've kind of upgraded the energy usage, the next thing we look at is solar, and we really talk about ways to install on-site renewables, because you're going to use some energy. So if you're going to use energy, let's look at ways to power that from renewable energy on site. I don't know, it kills me whenever I fly over industrial hubs and I just see these beautiful white or black roofs that are, 100,000, 300,000, 500,000 square feet, and there's not a lot of solar up there. There's mandates in California for residential homes to require solar, but it's kind of skipped a lot of the commercial market. And the industrial roof, these are perfect roofs for solar. Solar's not super heavy, so some of the older facilities, they might not be able to cover their whole roof, but they can definitely cover portions. But new facilities, especially ones built in California or complying with most codes, can install solar to pretty much cover the whole roof. So it's really, that's kind of the next step, is figuring out, now that we've reduced our energy, let's look at solar on site, and we can kind of talk about, to touch on solar, I think there's a whole thing to unpack there as well. And then after that, it's the vehicles. And electric vehicles are kind of the elephant in the room right now when we talk to developers. We can install infrastructure, we can oversize electrical panels and infrastructure. So when EV trucks are really on the market, we're ready to bring those into facilities. But some of the challenges figuring out what the infrastructure looks like on the building. Right now, we're seeing kind of two thoughts. Some people thought you would charge electric trucks at dock doors, but the charging time, may be, a couple hours. So now you're taking a dock door up to have a truck charging there. So now we're looking at auxiliary parking that actually would serve as EV truck charging. So we're pulling conduit, we're sizing panels out there for this future load. But just like the EV market, 10, 15 years ago, the plug connections, the power
Grant,
charging requirements.
We got a pretty bad connection here. It keeps chopping out. I don't know if your internet connection or what it is, but we even had a comment from Ron. It just seems laggy on his end.
Hey Chad, let's just keep going for now, and if it cuts back out, then I'll let you know. But that was about 10 minutes ago we left that, and we've been good for the last 5 minutes.
Okay. Sorry to interrupt you. I want to expand on all those topics though.
Yeah.
So I saw Beverly also join in and said hi, and Ron, thanks for joining in as well. Any questions that come up for Grant as we're going through here, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll answer all the questions that we can. So first point on LED, I love that point as well, because even beyond the how much more energy efficient they are, the light is just way better. So it's a huge improvement for a warehouse that goes from like those old halogen bulbs to new LED. And a client of mine actually just did this in one of his buildings. He had the ballasts that were still in there, and he just upgraded the lights to LED. So it didn't even require a full retrofit. It was rather inexpensive, and it made a significant difference both in energy efficiency and just how much brighter it made the warehouse. So that seems like an absolute easy thing that tenants or building owners can do. The solar panel one, I'm very intrigued about, and I agree. I can't even think of a building offhand. And Ron has a question on this as well. Does solar on new builds have to include a battery storage? Let's put that just on the sideline, and we will answer that because that's a great question, Ron. But I just even want to get your thoughts, Grant, on how could you break this down for a layman that doesn't understand solar at an engineer's level, where you can start determining the input and the output and all the numbers on there? Like what are some of like the back of the envelope math that someone could use to consider whether it's viable to put solar panels on a building?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So I think stepping back to sort of, solar 101, there's sort of two buckets for solar. And the first one is what we call behind the meter. And this is what most people think about when they think about solar. So this is going to be, solar is installed somewhere on the building, most likely the roof. Sometimes people will do carports as well. But this solar, historically, old utility meters had a dial that would spin forwards, and they never spun backwards until solar came on, but they'd spin forwards, and someone would come and manually read your meter at the end of every month and say, this month this building used 10,000 kilowatt hours. When solar came online, they actually called it net metering, because over the course of the day, your meter might actually be spinning backwards. So you'd be essentially having this virtual battery where when solar was being produced, your meter would be spinning backwards, and your solar is only producing during the peak hours of the day. But you obviously use electricity throughout the entire 24 hours. You might only produce solar for 8. So during that time, your meter would be spinning back, and they call that net metering. So, if for a net zero building or a building that's, sort of quote unquote off the grid, at the end of the year, you'd be using 100% of your energy usage would be produced from solar. So you net meter this it basically balance out at zero. So that's sort of this behind the meter solar solution. You're feeding power to your building. The utility grid essentially operates as a battery, because they're quote unquote storing that extra power for you. So you can draw back, you can give them a kilowatt during the day that you can use at night, and they charge you a small connection fee, but it's nominal, to basically utilize their utility grid as a battery. It's a net benefit because the high peak hours in most places are during the day. So you're actually helping serve as a generating plant to help others who need power during the day, give that to them on kind of a, clean energy. The utility is able to generate cheaper power at night when you might need the excess power. So it balances out pretty well. So that's this, behind the meter solar we're seeing. A big trend we're seeing now in industrial is actually what they call front of meter. And essentially what's happening is solar, industrial developers are installing solar to maximize the roof area, but none of that solar goes to the building tenant. It actually gets sold to the utility. There are a variety of places on the East Coast. City of Los Angeles does this. We're seeing it in places in Colorado, where you can install solar on your roof, and the utility will buy that from you on a 20-year contract for a fixed rate. The ROIs are huge, and we're seeing that sort of being the prevailing trend with solar on industrial facilities, because they can maximize the roof area. They have a stable return, and it doesn't matter who their tenant is. So they don't have to deal with, potentially putting up an investment to sell power to the tenant. This power gets fed to a contract. It helps obviously benefit, renewable energy goals, decrease in, our dependence on fossil fuels. So there's a great net benefit as well. So those are sort of the two trends that we're seeing people take when they come to installing solar on industrial facilities. With the behind the meter, where you're using it directly on site, we are seeing some nuances there and some challenges. So Ron brought up a great question about battery. Historically, you've been able to use the utility grid as somewhat of a battery. They'll take your electricity that you produce during the day, but in states like Hawaii or in California or in areas that have high saturation of renewables, some places there's too much. There's actually too much solar in certain parts of the grid where they actually can't use all that, and they either have to ground that electricity, or sometimes they'll ship it on transmission lines to other jurisdictions, and they'll actually pay for that. They're not getting a benefit from that. So we're seeing now when you're connecting or interconnecting solar, there's a lot of grid balancing. So I think that's, and they're actually charging more for that. So I think that's where battery is going to play a huge role here, is you're able to now obviously store and then use that electricity. You'll still be connected to the grid. So if you need electricity, or a tenant comes in with higher demands, you still have that benefit, but now you're able to, utilize energy storage, discharge that in the evenings, or even charge those batteries from the utility grid. And some of these facilities have huge demand charges. They're using tons of power during, let's say 10 to 4, which is really the peak in California. So they'll actually use the battery to help curb demand charges that can sometimes, be more than your supply charges for electricity. And to Ron's point, I talked about California. They have a code for solar requirements on residential, but starting in 2023 with our new code cycle, will actually require solar on industrial buildings. It's a function of conditioned floor area, so it's not going to be a huge amount of solar. It's really to cover the office and portions of the warehouse, unless it's a cold storage or conditioned warehouse. But if you were required to install solar, you're also required to install batteries. So these new warehouse facilities being built to the California code next year will both require solar and battery, which I think is going to be really interesting. From my standpoint, as a sustainability consultant, really focusing in this space, I think if you're required to install a small amount of solar, there's going to be great opportunities if you're already crossing, I call that penny gap. If you're already going to put up some capital to install solar, there's going to be a lot of opportunities to install a lot more, because to mobilize a crew, to go through the permitting process, to procure equipment, a lot of that is just the cost of doing business. There's a certain cost of permitting that's just going to be, the same if you install, a small solar system that meets code or a much larger solar system. But there's going to be a lot of opportunities to maximize all ROI and really create in the coming years with that. So it looks like sorry, I cut out again there, Chad.
Yeah, that's okay. Could be on my end as well. So I want to dive into solar more, because I'm quite curious about it. And you mentioned ROI on the in front of the meter developers, on some of these guys that are doing it and then not even using it for the building but selling it back to the grid.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any recent examples, and without having to get into any specific names or anything, but just like a rough idea of what the cost is to do it and what the ROI is?
Yeah, so I'll focus on a program in Los Angeles. They call it so LADWP is the LA City Utility, and they have a program called Feed and Tariff. So essentially what they do is a private developer puts up the capital to build solar on their warehouse roof, but it could also be any commercial properties. It could even be ground mounted in the desert. So you just put up the capital to install solar, but I'll focus on a lens of industrial. So we've seen tenants or we've seen developers, cover the roof. They'll put up about a megawatt of solar. A megawatt of solar, cost varies, but that could be about $1 million to put that solar up. So they're putting up, some extensive capital to put this on their roof. But what's going to happen is now they enter into an agreement with the utility. So over the course of 20 years, they're going to buy every unit of electricity or every kilowatt hour at a fixed rate. And that rate right now is about 14 cents. So over the course of this 20-year contract, we're seeing payouts of, 4, 5, 6 million. There are some variables on that rate. So you're seeing pretty good returns, where we're seeing private equity even come in and work with developers so the developer won't put up the money. The developer will get a roof lease from the solar developer or private equity, $100,000 a year, and this private equity firm will then interact with the utility to collect that revenue over the course of 20 years. So we're seeing it as a good investment vehicle as well, and we're seeing a lot of private equity dive into that space. That's not exclusive, so the ROIs can, be from, 4 or 5, 600 kind of % on, your investment. And there are some kickers and some different aspects, but the cost of solar has dropped tremendously. So it really makes this kind of an attractive investment especially for industrial developers.
Yeah, I smiled there, because that was exactly what I was going to ask you, is if a developer didn't want to do this themselves, if they could lease the roof. And perhaps that's a common for some people to hear that, but for me, that is a brave new world that we're getting into, where now a building owner can essentially look at leasing the interior, and they can also perhaps do a lease on the roof, which I think for anyone out there that's in a position to look at that, whether you own the property or whether you're just on the side of lining this up, if you can generate money on a roof that historically has made nothing, that's a whole new revenue stream for the developer, and just contributing to to the grid, and providing more power to the grid is certainly not a bad thing, particularly in areas where you've got like rolling blackouts and everything that goes with that. That's fascinating, the roof lease aspect. Is there a size where it just doesn't make sense? Like, obviously at 300,000 square feet, if you can put a megawatt up there and have that $1 million infrastructure you can justify, is there like a cutoff, like a natural cutoff, or some gray area where it just isn't economically viable to do it?
It's a good question. I think it depends on the goals. If we're talking about these front of meter where you're installing the capital and feeding electricity to the grid, you know, there may be sizes that just the cost doesn't always pencil. So on some of these, a warehouse roof that might be under 100,000 square feet, it may not make sense to sell that electricity, to the grid. The cost of mobilizing a crew to install that may not pencil as well. There's still going to be ROI, don't get me wrong, but there's economies of scale on these larger warehouse roofs. That being said, I think the smaller warehouses definitely benefit from doing solar installs that can actually feed the tenant and the tenant's needs. And we're seeing, I think the challenge right now is, when we talk about leasing out the roof, is a lot of historical industrial leases didn't have a provision that pulled the roof out of the lease. As a tenant, you leased everything, and the roof was somewhat included. So we're also seeing industrial developers starting to, when they renew leases, they have green lease language that helps look at sustainability in their operations, but it also pulls the roof out of these leases, which, again, the idea is that would allow the developer in the future to engage in one of these front of meter solar agreements where they can now lease the roof out as well. So I think we're seeing that as being a really interesting trend. Some tenants are not okay with that. Amazon's a good example that when developers try to pull the roof out of the lease, Amazon doesn't allow that, and Amazon for a while was sort of driving a lot of the industrial market, and that was because Amazon had their own solar kind of arm that they would install solar on every warehouse they operated. So there was they had kind of their own language there, but for most developers, that's what they're starting to do. And it's beneficial too, because a lot of these, these REITs, some of their bylaws don't allow them necessarily to do anything except lease real estate. So selling electricity doesn't really fall within that. So some of them are rewriting maybe some of their bylaws or creating separate entities so they can actually put up the capital and then sell the power back to the tenants, because not every market, there are only few markets that allow you to sell power directly to this utility in these agreements. So in the markets that you can't do that, they have to find unique ways to do that. So we started with the Inland Empire. Let's go back to the Inland Empire. The utility there is Southern California Edison, and they don't have one of these front of meter solar programs. So what you have to do there is if you install solar as the developer, you put the capital up. Now you have to sell this power back to the tenant. There's great margins there. What we're seeing is you can put solar up at a cost of somewhere around 6 to 7 cents. That kind of makes sense as an ROI for the developer, and the utility rate there is 13 or 14 cents. So there's tons of savings, about 50% there, that then can be spread either to the tenant. So the tenant can get 15, 20% cheaper electricity, and the developer can take this rest of this, savings as revenue for that install. So we're seeing developers put solar up on their own, and also private equity look into some of these spaces as well, where they'll partner with the developer, they'll give them that roof lease, they'll put up the capital, and then they'll manage all of the billing between the tenant and this private equity firm now. So there's lots of different financing vehicles and kind of the best approach. It's not really a one size fits all. I think different use cases, different locations, different utilities. There's it's kind of it's a moving target right now, but there's so many great financing vehicles and companies that have huge financial backing to install solar across the United States that I think we're really going to see a huge influx now. I think over the last, at least for what I've seen in the market over the last 18 months, we've seen a huge perpetuation in solar for industrial projects. And I only think we haven't even hit that inflection point yet where we're really going to see that take off. But I think in the next 12 to 18 months, we're just going to see almost every new development, every new warehouse installing solar, not just because it makes sense for the environment, but it also is going to make sense financially.
Great point. I love how you put both of those in there, because I think there's definitely a desire for people to be environmentally sensitive, but there still needs to be a business case for it. And in your case, you can have your pie and eat it too. I like, even a couple buildings that I own, I've got the wheels in motion where I'm thinking, if I can put solar panels on those and either do it as a roof lease or do it as some sort of mechanism to bring in other revenue, if you can capitalize that revenue, you just created value in your property automatically. So I'm fascinated by that idea, and I agree with you. I think that will be the trend going forward. We're hearing it more and more, as well as that it's being driven by companies just as much as it's being mandated by different levels of government. So if the companies are requesting it, that are ultimately leasing the space, and the government's starting to put in requirements for it, I completely agree. I think that this will go forward on that. There was a couple questions that came in from Ron, so I just want to address those before we move on, because I want to talk about electric vehicles. And although at first glance it might not seem like that would have major implications for the warehouse space, you hinted at it earlier at how it could, because these vehicles are going to need to be charged. So that's either going to require more space on the yard, or it's going to require some infrastructure. So I want to dive into that, because I think that's another thing that's imminent, that's coming inevitably. So how can building owners be prepared for that? But before we get to that, I just wanted to answer some of those questions for Ron. Does solar and new builds have to include battery storage? I think you got that right. That will be something that new buildings are going to incorporate.
In the state of California, their new building code that goes online January 1 of 2023. If solar is required on a building, battery will be required also. But that's just for the state of California, and that's their new building code. Other places, it's still voluntary if you want to install battery.
Okay. Next question: is industrial consumption pretty even with production?
And I'm looking at this maybe through a lens of renewable energy or solar. So is the consumption that the industrial facility uses, does that line up with the production you can generate on the roof? I'll use that as kind of the question here, and hopefully that answers that, Ron. It depends. So for some industrial facilities, if we're looking at third-party logistics, a dry storage facility that is unconditioned in California, the amount of consumption that facility uses, the amount of solar you need to offset that consumption is about 25 to 30% of the roof area. So 25 to 30% of the roof area would meet that facility's consumption requirements. Let's move now to climates in the Midwest or the East Coast, where you have conditioned warehousing for portions of the year. Now you're looking to like 50 to 60% of the roof area, and these are just for dry storage. So no major conveyors. You have forklift loads, but you're not going to have any sort of refrigeration or heavy process loads inside the facility. As soon as you start getting into heavy process loads or conveyors or cold storage, you would need multiple roofs to meet that requirement. So it definitely depends on what's going on inside the building. We worked on one facility that the entire roof, it was about 200,000 square feet, and what they were doing inside the facility was such a high process load that the amount of solar we covered across the entire roof only met 2% of their entire consumption over the course of the year. So it totally varies, and that was an extremely high process load manufacturing facility. So it varies, and it just depends on kind of the use case. But with most kind of third-party logistics or kind of dry storage, you can meet 100% of your consumption with your roof area in all parts of the country. And as you get into more and more process loads, that changes, and it's the facilities all look the same for the most part from the outside, but what goes on inside is really what drives that energy use. And it totally varies.
So if I've learned anything so far from this call, that manufacturing company should have joined up with a private equity firm, did a ahead of the meter back to the grid sale, and then sold out based on some market valuation of the roof lease. That's what maybe a good strategy would have been.
It would have been. As the place this building was built, they didn't have that infrastructure in place with the utilities. So no, that would have been a great idea if that was.
Yeah, my wheels are turning on all the different ways you could.
Yeah. I love it.
So Ron said, "Yep, thanks." He was thinking like general warehousing, lighting, HVAC, like you mentioned, would be common in a 3PL or distribution building. And I think there was another question from Ron on there, Wyatt, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe it was just I don't know if it was a comment. That's what prompted the question. Actual experience with solar in Vegas, the providers are losing operating money. Have you heard of this being like there not being a business case, and it solely just becomes down to an energy efficiency standpoint?
Well, it's funny he mentions Vegas. The project that I was talking about is actually also in the state of Nevada, not in the Vegas market. So yeah, it depends. NV Energy or Nevada Energy is the utility that's across the state of Nevada. Warren Buffett owns that. I'm surprised the utility rates haven't increased yet. I think they will over time. But Nevada's, I think, the third cheapest utility in the nation. Their rates are somewhere in the realm of 4 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So it's extremely, extremely cheap. Solar still pencils, but where we see an ROI of somewhere in the realm of 3 to 5 years in California, the ROI, if you're doing strict cash outlay for solar in the state of Nevada, we're typically seeing that somewhere in the 10 on the short end, but closer to 12 to 14. So the cost is not as beneficial. It's also not as favorable what we're seeing. So there's some states I think it still makes sense, but it just depends.
Yeah, and one more point from Ron. Minimum hookup fees are going up 500% or so. Are you seeing that as well?
It depends on the markets. And when he says hookup fees, that could be there's different things we're looking at. One is interconnection fees you pay to the utility, but then it's also just the install costs. And I mentioned that solar has gone down significantly. There were tariffs put in place. We're getting a lot of solar coming from China, and we're looking to ramp up production. So there were some tariffs slapped on there that definitely increased the cost of solar for a bit. But again, utilities are looking at, utilities for a long time were providing this net energy metering benefit to people that installed solar. And those that didn't have solar sort of said this is disproportionately impacting us because these groups aren't paying their fair share of the burden. When we think about buying electricity from the grid, we're not just paying for each unit of electricity that comes into our facility or our building. We're also paying to maintain the grid. We're paying for infrastructure upgrades. So if you're not really paying any utility bills, your neighbor who is paying is now disproportionately paying for upgrades to the facility. So we are seeing, to Ron's point, utilities trying to scratch back as much cost from those installing solar as possible. So it's, in certain markets, it's the ROI can be more challenging. But I still think in a lot of places it pencils. There's just different ways to figure out, how that works. But yeah, the logistics and some of the policy in solar is constantly evolving, and I think it's going to be an interesting space to watch in kind of how that evolves.
And Ron's a industrial real estate investor and lawyer based out of Dallas, and he's got a YouTube channel as well. And I think people should go on to his YouTube channel. He just bought a 5.5 acre site of industrial land. I think people should tell him that he should build a solar farm on that 5.5 acres of land. So go check out Ron's channel. So let's move over to electric vehicles, because this in my mind, is going to have a profound impact on the industrial real estate market. And we don't even need to go down the road of autonomous driving, because I think that in itself is going to have a big impact, but even just electric vehicles. So for semi trucks, how close are we to seeing electric powered semi trucks right now?
So they're out there. I think they're cost prohibitive, and there's the production of those is still very boutique. So the cost doesn't necessarily pencil at this point. So I think short answer is there are some companies, Tesla is like kind of the elephant in the room. They have some trucks. They're from their gigafactory where they do a lot of their batteries for the Tesla vehicles. You'll see them on the road out there in kind of the Reno, greater Reno, Fernley area. So we definitely see them, but it's very, very small, and I think it's more of a marketing ploy than anything else. The range and charging requirements don't necessarily make sense yet. But I think in the next few years we're definitely going to see fully EV trucks be really driving the market. The other thing that I think we're going to see too is, what we'll call like near zero emission vehicles. So they're not going to necessarily be fully EV long hauls or trucks, but we'll see hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. I think the benefit of that is, with charging, we have to have this infrastructure. So if you have a long haul truck, at some point they need to charge, and that it's going to take a while for these larger batteries. So I think with hydrogen fuel cells, you can fill those up like you can at a typical, diesel pump, but you're filling up with hydrogen. And then those run, kind of in a similar electric motor. So they have zero emissions from the actual exhaust pipe of the truck, but they kind of give us a similar operating process as you'd have with standard trucks today. So I think it's going to be a combination. I don't think it's just going to be electric trucks that dominate the market. I think we'll see a combination of hybrid, hydrogen fuel cell, and then electric vehicles kind of dominating that space. But I think that adds a unique challenge is since developers at this point, I wish I had a crystal ball. I could tell you what it's going to look like in a few years. I think sometimes developers come to us and they want that, but our expertise, we really work on, consulting in the design, construction, and operations of the building itself. So a lot of the stuff around the vehicle operations, isn't what I'm necessarily focused in. I follow it just from a passion, and we're helping develop and design the infrastructure for these trucks, but we don't necessarily know what those trucks will look like yet. So as I mentioned, what we're looking at right now is there a place, and we're designating areas in the truck yard to build sort of EV charging gas stations. So it would be an area that you can dock your truck, and you can have multiple truck stalls there to charge. Because initially we thought we would charge them all, like I mentioned, in the dock doors, but we started to think about how much time you need to charge these, and now you're taking up time at a dock door when you could be charging elsewhere. So now we're pulling conduit and sizing electrical panels elsewhere on these properties. So I don't know, it's a very interesting conversation, and I think that it's one that over the next few years will evolve, and maybe the prevailing thoughts we have now could be totally different than what comes online in a few years. Short haul, we're seeing much more of those, and again, the battery requirements and charging requirements are more in line with passenger vehicles. So those are a bit easier to kind of understand, and but again, I think the idea is really starting to develop these kind of truck court charging areas that are really designed for EV vehicles.
You mentioned this is just a passion of yours, and I share that passion just with the industrial real estate market. It's just something that I actively follow as a hobby as well as my job, and it sounds like it's much the same with you in the sustainability world. What's your background on how you got into this, and what took you to where you are today?
Yeah, well, my background, my passion, I guess, from just as a child was always been in kind of design and construction. I mean, what kid doesn't like, construction sites and, giant machinery? It's just, I think it's always so cool. And my parents were both architects. So I think I had this, always fascination with that space. But always felt there's a way that we could look at, design and construction from a, again, to use the buzzword, more sustainable practice. And, when I learned about LEED, which is a rating system that's kind of, international rating system to standardize sustainable buildings, I was like, this is perfect. It kind of combines two of my things that I love, sustainability and, kind of natural resource conservation with, design, construction, and architecture. So I went to school and focused on renewable energy systems with really an emphasis on the built environment. I worked in renewables, so a lot of my interest, passion, and expertise from solar comes from, experience previously working at a solar company. But then realized there's such a holistic lens, and that's when I got into the consulting world around the built environment. And that's what I've been doing ever since, is really helping, developers, architects, general contractors look at ways to decrease their carbon emissions, with a lens on the built environment. So, and I think it's such a, there's so much in that space, and I think we're seeing corporations, developers, architects, all grappling with how they can do their part. So some of that doesn't necessarily fall in the scope of work that I'm doing on a daily basis, but yeah, I'm up late reading and watching videos and digging into it all, because I think that we're at a critical point right now where we need development, as we mentioned, 1% vacancy rate with industrial buildings. We have a need. I was just reading that this morning that the rental market will surpass its kind of annual development for the first time in a variety of years this year. We have a need for more residential spaces. Development's going to continue to grow, but I think we're doing ourselves a disservice for not thinking about how we can develop each new building as sustainable as possible. That's my passion, and I'm so happy I get to do it for work as well. So it is really a blessing.
That's, you're in a good position when you find something that you can do as a career, and it's something that you do even outside of work hours just because you love it so much. So I applaud you for that. And you guys have a guide. It's a sustainability guide that you put out specifically for industrial buildings. We put a link to that in the description. I'd encourage people to check it out. It's an awesome guide on anything you can do, all the way from small incremental things all the way up to large new developments. So that's an awesome guide. And I've also got a link to your LinkedIn, Grant. Any other way people can get in touch with you if they want to talk more about the consulting side or just ask you general questions?
Yeah, LinkedIn's a great place. My email is on our website and in that guide as well. So if you go on our website, which is GaiaDevelopment.com, there's lots of great ways you can contact me through there or others from our team. But LinkedIn's a great way as well, and happy to chat about things that nerd out just about sustainability in the built environment, or talk about ways that Gaia can provide services kind of within our role as a consulting firm. So like I said, this is just a fun space to be in right now. I think that we've seen huge incremental changes in sustainability around the built environment, and I'm excited to see where things continue to go.
Yeah, we're definitely going to need to catch up for a future episode, because I think we're on the cusp of this big change just in the way properties are built. And like you said, we're speculating to some extent on this stuff, but it will evolve in this. I think the industry will look completely different, even as quick as a few years from now as it does today. So I'd love to continue this conversation down the road as well.
No, 100%. I think the one that jumps to mind is, over the next kind of 12 to 18 months, we have this new kind of the bill that was just passed on, the inflation bill. There's so much packed in there around infrastructure for EV trucks, near EV trucks, renewable energy. So I'll be really interested to see how that helps perpetuate the market. I'm fingers crossed. I'm optimistic about it, but we'll have to circle back in 12, 18 months. I think there's going to be a lot of updates. Things that I said now may have come to pass. Other things may be different. So it'll be cool to see how that helps drive the market.
Yeah, that's the story of life with my channel is I sometimes say things or make predictions and then I'm like, well, that's going to be on the internet forever. So hopefully I'm right at least a couple times. So, okay, well, that's awesome. Grant, thanks again for, Ron said thanks as well. That was awesome. I love the points about solar particularly, and then the EV is going to be crazy to watch as well. So I'll reach out to you in the near future here and we'll line up another episode.
Awesome. Chad, thanks for having me on. It was a pleasure, and looking forward to continuing the conversation in future episodes and offline as well.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks, Grant.
All right. Thank you.
Take care.